Okay, so I'm going to do a quick review, and because I want to make sure that everybody's got the context with every step of the way. So we've been talking about Pashtun power, and we're up to the point where the Pashtuns have projected power abroad, right? In the Delhi Sultanate, the fifth one was the Pashtun sub-tribe Lodi, and then over Sher Shah over and all the way over in Patna. But what's going on back in Pashtun homeland? And I thought it would be worthwhile just to go back in time. And I want to solidify Pashtun connection to the Mamluks. The Mamluks, you remember, were really big in 1200. They threw the Crusaders out of the Holy Land, and they also established the first Delhi Sultanate. But they come into Afghani life, Pashtun history much earlier. And then secondly, to relate all this to today, what is ISK? And if that's not a familiar term, I'm sure you recognize what is it exactly. And I'm going to answer that and make a connection to the present moment before we go back and resume where we stopped off. So let's time travel back to 1000 to 1200, the Goric Sultanate. But where did the Goric Sultanate come from? So let's go back even a little bit further. And you notice at the time the Goric Sultanate in central Afghanistan is established, the Seljuk Turks have roared down from the steppes and have pretty much taken over Persia, and they've gone to the Holy Land. And that was one of the reasons for the Crusades. It was one thing to have Arabs in charge of the Holy Land, but when the Seljuk Turks kind of pushed the Arabs out, things became much more difficult to get safe passage to Jerusalem. So that was one motivation. Now notice the Seljuk Turks pushed out the Arabs, right? So the Arabs had a great run from 700 to 1200 to the Abbasids. And they had influence with Sufi missionaries and trade all the way to Indonesia. But the Turks are going to kind of come down from the steppes and spoil the party. And I want to fill that in so you have that story clear as we go forward. So what was the genesis of the Gorids themselves? So now we go back another 100 years, and we have the Ghaznavids, and they were a Persian Muslim dynasty, but their origins were Turkic-Mamluk. So what's a Mamluk? Mamluk are the warrior class that the Turks developed with their own indigenous troops, but also from captured soldiers from the other side. So they, instead of executing them, they said, would you like to join our elite corps? And a lot of them took that and became Mamluks. And they had tremendous eventual influence, taking over Egypt just before they went up and pushed the Crusaders out of the Holy Land, who'd come because the Seljuks were depriving them of safe passage to Jerusalem. So they also have a presence in Afghanistan and are the military arm of the Ghaznids. And the Ghaznavids, their influence obviously extended all the way throughout Afghanistan and into northern India. And so in that sense, the people of central Afghanistan shared being occupied by Ghazni. Now, Muhammad of Ghazni transformed this really into an empire by conquering on multiple subcontinents. And here he is in his court. And he set up a military regime with guard towers and all across the Silk Road in Middle East. But not only that, he was interested in culture. And there was a poet, a Persian poet, Federuz, who wrote the Book of Kings. And I bring this up, it's called the Shahnameh, because it gets to the original question, what is civilization? And what's the difference between civilization and culture? And I'm going to hold this example out as a prime example of culture, the Book of Kings. And it was written for Mahmud, and it's being read to him by the poet. And it has become the national epic of Greater Iran. So there's a culture of Greater Iran. And if you think about American civilization, well, we're a part of Anglo-Saxon culture. We certainly know the prominent kings and queens of England and the stories. Similarly, the Book of Kings tells the story of Iran to the larger area. And we've already learned that the Shiite revolution in 1500, led by Ismail, he was very multicultural. Remember all the influences in his family tree? He was primarily Kurdish, but there was also Azerbaijani and Georgian. So similarly, we're seeing that the Persia is becoming very multicultural, and this Book of Kings is shared throughout the region in not only Afghanistan and Azerbaijan, but Tajikistan, Armenia, Dagestan, Georgia, Turkmenistan, Turkey, and finally Uzbekistan. I'm going to spend some time on Uzbekistan later. All right, so culture, it's just important to know when we go all the way back to Ghazni. And so he sets up this empire. But what has that got to do with the Gori in Afghanistan? They were Buddhist. So they had somehow, in that part of Afghanistan, avoided Islam. And we know from bitter experience that it's very easy to wall yourself off in Afghanistan in valleys protected by rugged mountains. So the Gori in central Afghanistan were still Buddhist. Now, we've heard that Pashtun lore, and we're focusing on Pashtuns as the main spine of the story, which we've justified earlier by showing that the majority of the Taliban are a Pashtun, 32 out of the 33 in the cabinet. But it's unclear to what extent Pashtun culture and Pashtunwali was also an influence, a tribal influence, in addition to the Buddhist religious influence. So it's an open question, but they converted. So they were converted by the Ghaznis in 1011, and they eventually set up their own dynasty, succeeding after the Ghaznis declined. So it was of Iranian origin, but very mixed. The question of whether they were actually Pashtuns is up for debate. A Brit, and we're going to start hearing more and more about British analysis using methods from the Enlightenment to try to settle arguments. And we'll hear more about Stone later. But he studied this area, and he was pretty convinced that the Gore Dynasty was Pashtun. But modern scholars say, well, not so fast. From the evidence, we can assume that it was mainly Tajik. So it gets to the question that was asked by Carol last week about the ethnicity and who's who. We are going to get a lot of mixture, but it's not important. The DNA is just not important. What is important is the stories, the culture, and we see that the Book of Kings is telling us that there is a larger Persian culture. And
excuse me.
Yeah.
Okay, so if they have had, the Pashtuns have had this Persian influence, then why today do they have such a conflict with the people of the North East, along the what is that pasture land up there, that the area that the Russians came through? They're Tajiks. Remember the guy Mahmud who got killed? They're more Iranian Tajiks. And if the Pashtuns are Iranian Tajiks, or possibly Iranian Tajiks, why are they fighting so much today?
Well, what was the question was the province of Gore specifically, not this whole area. The further north you go, the further mix there is. And so this band that comes across central to southern Afghanistan is definitely Pashtun, and it spills over into Pakistan. The smaller question of what exactly was the Goric dynasty, it being more north, certainly more north than Kandahar, which is the center of Pashtunwali. Also shared a cross border in Pakistan itself. The further north you go, the more Turkic influence. And that's why I bought in and went back to the 1200s to show that already then you had a Turkic influence. First, it was the Seljuks who came roaring down and started raising hell and made the Holy Land not safe for pilgrims. And then now you're getting another wave, and we'll know we've already talked about the previous waves, but we're time traveling back and looking at it's a prequel, if you will. So another prequel is the Mamluks, this warrior class that all the Turks developed as almost an institution. And the Mamluks had tremendous influence not only on the Ghaznis, but also on the Goric dynasty. And all of that last slide said was, you can't assume that the people this far north were Pashtun. They may have been Tajik, but that's looking at DNA, and I think that's irrelevant. I would say, what stories have they adopted? And what I'm telling you is the Iranian, the Book of Kings, what the poet wrought, which is the story of Persian history all the way back before Cyrus, right? It goes, that book takes you right up to the Muslim invasion. And so that's sort of like pre-Islamic history that all of these areas share, whether they're Tajik tribally, or Uzbek tribally, or Turkmenistani tribally. There is a unifying culture. And so you have many different realms of influence in Afghanistan, which sits right in the middle of all this. And so I hope that answered your question, Aiko.
Yeah. So you're saying that you were talking when you said that the influence of Iran, it was mostly the Gore people, not all, the Pashtuns.
Yeah. I was talking about just this Goric Sultanate that existed, because this was probably the first homegrown empire, if you will, on Afghani soil. So whether it was Tajik or Pashtuns that did it, we're going to see by the end of this a clear-cut, slam dunk Pashtun dynasty, but I wanted to include this as a prequel. This is Afghani empire on training wheels, baby steps. And it was not clearly Pashtun, and it's not clearly Tajik, but for me, it's almost beside the point. If they all accept the Book of Kings, they're in the same cultural area. And I think we have to keep that in mind and not get too worried about the DNA.
So the Pashtuns never accepted the Book of Kings.
Yes, they did.
Well, they did?
Yes, they consider themselves part of a greater Iran, looking at the influences before Islam. But the Book of Kings stops with Islam.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm going to go on now. So the Gore Dynasty was quite significant. They built beautiful buildings and madrasas. You can find this in central Afghanistan, a surviving minaret, 1174. It's a consequential empire, and the Mamluks play a role. Just like the Mamluks were part of the Ghaznis, they were also a big part of the Goric dynasty in central Afghanistan. And remember, this is a Turkish warrior class. And so they were involved, and when they started fighting with each other, that was the end of the Goric dynasty. So what did these Mamluks do? We've talked about this before, but I want to reconnect the Mamluks to the Delhi Sultanate. They went south from Afghanistan and captured Delhi and consolidated political power in Delhi and established the first Delhi Sultanate, which evolved. And by the time you get to the fifth Delhi Sultanate, it is Pashtun. It is clearly Pashtun. It's the Lode subtribe from eastern Pashtun territory, and they go down and take over the Delhi Sultanate. And that's the first time that the Pashtuns had projected power outside of their homeland. So they built on what the Turkic slave generals had done, the Mamluks. But the Goric dynasty also was succeeded to the east by this group, but it evolved eventually in the Khorasan empire. At least it was centered in Khorasan. And have you all heard the name Khorasan recently? Yes, you have. And centered in Khorasan, this is the empire that reached its peak in 943. And you've heard about the Islamic State of Khorasan, ISK. And they, for some reason, have picked the peak of the Khorasan realm as a role model for their version of Islamic State. They want to rebuild a caliphate, and they think Khorasan is the best place to do it. And these guys are Wahabis, as distinguished from Deobandi. Now, this distinction is going to become important because Deobandis execute Wahabis. So the first, and you see the leader of ISK, he was captured by the Americans, put in jail. And when the Taliban opened the jails and released everybody, they said, but not you. And Abu Omar Khorasani, they changed their names, these warriors. And he's changed his name based on the province of Khorasan. And they executed him. The Taliban executed this Wahhabist because they are Deobandi. So I'll come back to that in our diagram later on. But now I kind of want to return to the trunk of where we were, 1500. And real quickly, just you remember Sher Shah Suri, who carved out the second Pashtun dynasty, very briefly, number 2, in Patna, that strange story of Patna. How did Pashtuns get all the way over to Patna? But you can look back to those days and argue that there was a certain internationalism, globalism back then. And he seized control of Patna after Babur died. So Babur dies, his son isn't very strong. And Sher Shah, you'll remember, does all this great stuff. We've already gone over it before, but he was an able administrator, and his mosque built in Afghan architectural style survives in Patna. It was built in 1540. and it's not in the year 750 as claimed by the mythologists. He's got a statue is honored in Pashtun culture, an important hero, a Pashtun warrior. But Sher Shah's son wasn't very strong, and this Pashtun was wiped out with the help of the Safavids, of all people. So they started mucking around and interfering with Pashtun politics even back then, and we certainly see echoes of that today. And part of the problem was the grandson of Babur was very strong. So he wasn't going to stand any Pashtun autonomy in Patna, and he wiped it out. In Pashtun culture, this is a calamity. And the word in Pashto, and you remember from last week that Pashto, the language was invented about this time. And the word for calamity is Mughal, because Akbar ruined the Pashtun picnic in Patna. You'll remember, and I just want to review this real quick to get us back into context. This great Pashtun writer, he's the one that invented the Pashto language almost single-handedly. He was a warrior poet, a Sufi, and as we've said, the background for a lot of Islam at this time throughout this region is Sufi. He obviously mastered Persian so that he could understand the Book of Kings, for instance, but also the neighboring languages. And he created the concept of Pashtunistan. And in his mind, it was going to be an enlightened Sufi homeland, Pashtun homeland. And it was conceived in defeat. It was after they lost Patna. And I want you to just notice on the map the introduction of a couple of new actors in the drama that's going to be coming. This is Sindh. Has in the Punjab and south of the Punjab. The brown is the Punjab, but Punjab and Sindh are the main provinces of Pakistan today. Obviously, Kashmir is disputed, but this is going to become part of the new great game a little bit later. So welcome them to the cast. This is how Pir Roshan's art came into it, how he wrote. He derived 13 new letters using the Arabic script for Pashto. And he's been the inspiration for many writers. In summary, this is who he was. He was a nationalist. He was popular with secularites. He's a very mild Sufi style. A real believer in nationalism. And his influence continued for this movement for over 100 years with his sons and grandsons. And in the tradition that was going on in Europe at the time of the Enlightenment, he was a rationalist. So you wonder about the intellectual connections. But one of his pet peeves was he thought Akbar was running a personality cult, especially this new religion he was coming up with that combined a lot of different religions. And some of us may know people who are currently of the Baha'i faith. So this is very much in the tradition of what Akbar was trying to do. Of course, his blend included Zoroastrianism. So that's interesting. Everybody has a critic, and nobody can get away without making enemies. And Roshan made his enemies. There was conservative religious thinking even back then. So I've said that Sufi was dominant, but there was also a very strong Hanafi tradition that didn't go along with these modern values that Roshan was proffering. So this guy Derwiza is even quoted today. And let's just look at this one more time in the light of what we've just covered. Just a quick review. This is all of Muslims, basically Shia and Sunni. What's Sufi? Sufi is an overlie that you can take any of these and plug in Sufi mysticism to get a more gentle, muted version, maybe. But a muted version is certainly what we need this day and age. So Shia, Sunni, last week we talked about the 12ers. So this week I just want to take this Sunni branch and focus on a couple of offshoots here in the light of what we just said. So I told you earlier that the Taliban are Deobandi. So they're on the Hanafi. In general, the Hanafi is a little bit more open to modernization, to debate and change, as opposed to Hanbali, who are fundamentalists who take the Quran literally. So we have that split, obviously, in our culture as well. And so there it's Hanbali versus Hanafi, but each one has their own offshoots. And one of these is the Deobandi. And the Eastern version, so we're talking about East versus West here. And for this discussion, Afghanistan is in the eastern end of Islam. The Deobandi, if you want to be radical in the east end of Islam, you're probably going to be Deobandi and use them as your guide. And sure enough, the Taliban is an offshoot of Deobandi thought, which is prevalent on the eastern end, Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, even further east, and the UK. Interesting, a lot of Indians have immigrated. Indian Muslims have immigrated to England. So there you are, and Taliban are in charge. And all of a sudden, into their realm, onto their turf, have come the Wahhabists. And I'm going to talk about how Wahhabists got all the way over to the east. They're Arabs, basically, influenced by the Arabic version. And not only are they fundamentalists, as most people in Saudi Arabia are, but they're fundamentalists to the extreme. So you have the Wahhabis, you have the Salafists. I'll talk about, it's a subtle difference, but the offshoot of them is Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has a set of beliefs, and ISIS has a set of beliefs that are enunciated and can easily be distinguished from the Deobandi. And that's why you have Deobandis executing Wahhabis, very, very far removed on the Islam tree. Now, let's go back to the Pashtuns. So I want to talk about this guy, Katak, because his name will come up periodically when you're talking about the fortunes of Pashtuns these days. He was a tribal leader, so he was political, and he inherited what he got. And he, you might argue, was a Quisling. He, as opposed to Roshan, he worked with the Mughals. And he served Shah Jahan. And anybody that's been to the Taj Mahal knows who Shah Jahan was. So you had a Pashtun operative operating inside the Mughal government. Well, let's see if that did him any good. He was also, you'll remember, involved with the buildings in Kabul. This is the gardens in Kabul. And Shah Jahan has built some white marble structures in Kabul, in that magnificent park that has fallen into neglect. So Katak is involved in the width and breadth of the Mughals, even all the way into Kabul, which is a little bit north of the Pashtun heartland. And this, of course, is Shah Jahan's most memorable. But what did Katak get for all of his serving of the Mughals? He was treated very badly by the Aurangzeb, the sixth and the last effective Mughal ruler. And let's just review all of the big four Mughals, right? We talked about Babur, who came from way, way up in the north, the Fergamon Valley, and eventually took over Tamerlane's realm, and building on that, eventually created the rule of Kabul. And it was from Kabul, and this is why Babur's gardens are built in Kabul. This became his main base, and he used that to launch the conquest of Delhi, and took it away from, ironically, a Pashtun dynasty, the Lodi, right? And in so doing, he established the Mughal Empire in 1525. And then we've talked about Akbar already, and his role in taking Patna away from a Pashtun. We just finished talking about Shah Jahan and Katak, a collaborating Pashtun, worked with him, but Aurangzeb imprisons Katak. So, by the way, just real quick, Akbar's tomb is in the suburb of Sikandar in Agra. I found that interesting. Kandahar, Sikandar It's a similar name. I'll give you a second to think why they would have similar names so far apart. And it's because they're both, and also one of the Lode Pashtun heroes was called Sikandar Lode. So why do they all three have a Khand in the middle? And it's just because of its Alexander, the influence of Alexander coming down through the centuries. And if you haven't seen The Man Who Would Be King yet, be sure to watch it. Okay, so Katak, he took on this problem that he had been jailed, he had collaborated, and he'd learned his lesson. So he said, hey, Pashtuns, you have got to be strong. You've got to be warriors. And he built up and doubled down on Roshan's sense of nationalism. So here's his poem for unity and national liberation. Pick up the sword for the pride of Afghanistan. I'm a man of this day, fight. And he also wrote a poem called Displeasures with the Pashtuns. So no doubt some of this is built on the tribal rivalries and bickering that he saw. And he admonished the Pashtuns to cut it out. There's no deliverance in anything except the sword. And Afghanistans are just united and thinking that they can negotiate like he did with the Mughals are lost indeed. So he learned his lesson. And this is an address to soldiers divided by Pashtunwala. Hey, we're superior than the Mughals with fighting. But we're not so discreet with our thinking. All the different tribes have to support each other. And if we did that, kings would have to bow down before us. And so he was trying to build on the success of Sher Shah and the Lodis at the Delhi Sultanate. All right. So we haven't said anything about the Hindus for a long time. They lay low. All of a sudden, we've just been talking about Muslims coming into the area of Afghanistan, and certainly all of Afghanistan was in the Muslim faith. Probably mostly Sufi, but definitely not Hindu anymore, if there ever were any. So the religious settlement was Islam up where Afghanistan was, and then Islam had infiltrated and taken over northern India. Informally, probably with the Sufi missionaries. So you remember we talked earlier about how the Sufi missionaries who went all the way to Indonesia set up a marvelous globalized trade route. So you certainly had Muslim influence, but it was of the mercantile kind, because co-religionists would trust each other better. So it gave, with credit, it gave certain advantages, and business needs credit to survive. But there was no government, no Islamic government per se, until the Mamluks and the Delhi Sultanate. So that's why I wanted to go back and review who the Mamluks were, because they set up the Delhi Sultanate at about the same time that they took over Egypt, and then went up and drove the Crusaders back to Europe. So the Mamluks, interestingly enough, were involved against invading Christians from the north. And now we have the Mughals, which are heavily influenced by Afghani culture, or with Pashtun participation. Now you have that brand of Islam being threatened by Hindus from the south. We haven't heard much about Hindus. There's a lot going on in the south. It's very confusing. But I think if we just focus on the Marathas as a stand-in for what's happened in Hindu India since the time they were overrun by the Huns, at the same time Europe was overrun by the Huns. If we just use them as a stand-in, and take a look, and now we have to bring them back into the picture, because they have become militarily strong. And as the Mughals started to fragment, and it took another 100 years for the 150 years after Aurangzeb for the Mughal dynasty to finally fall to the Brits, of all people, but they did fall. But in that interim, before the Brits came in, the Hindus roared in and said, "Okay, Mughals, you've had your fun. We're coming back." And Hinduism has always been the law of land. You remember, it was bought there by Indo-Europeans, Aryans, from who started off in Turkmenistan. Indo-European language started maybe 4,000 years ago, centered in just north of current day Persia. So they're Indo-Europeans, and they're looking up and they're saying, you know, we've had enough of you Turkic warrior class Mamluks and Tajiks, and we're reclaiming the Ganges Valley. And up they came. So they fought the Mughals. And this is their great hero, Shivaji. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Obviously, an interesting guy, but here's their empire, and they spread it, Hindu empire, over most of the Indian subcontinent, and they're celebrated even today. The current state of Maharashtra goes from Mumbai to Goa. And this is from 1765. So they're pushing. Here's little Afghanistan quietly up here, safely out of the line of fire. And off we go, and now we're up to 1795. Here's Afghanistan now. Afghanistan's right on the border. We're going to talk about who's in power at this time. I'm just going to finish with Maharatha story, because there's some stories I don't want to fragment too much. I just want to bring this to completion. So even today, Shivaji is who he is, and finally their rule ended in 1818 at the hands of the British. So here's another player. We're introducing the Sikhs and the Sinds, and now we're introducing the British. into the great game that's going to be played out in Afghanistan. And you can see here again the Sikhs and the Sinds and a more modern Maratha state. So now we're at 1700, and I'll go ahead and get started. I'm only going to go for another 5 to 10 minutes, but let's get started on 1700 and see how far we can make our way to 1800. Now, you'll remember that after the Mamluks, there were more waves of Turks from the north. Tamerlane in 1300, he occupied all of Afghanistan. And I've made the point that Afghanistan has been conquered many times, just not by infidels. But he was wearing a Muslim hat at the time. And then 1500 by Babur. We've already talked about that. But now let's add a third Turkish threat from the north, and that's the Uzbeks. And in the Bukhara was their area, Uzbeks. And you can see they controlled other Turks, Tajiks in particular, a little bit of Afghanistan, where the Tajiks currently, you'll remember the Northern Alliance that went up against the Taliban. Aiko mentioned Massoud earlier. This is their strip of Afghanistan, almost exclusive. And then there's a mixed strip that includes Kabul. And then you have the Pashtun strip, which I'm arguing is the main chess piece in this whole thing, which is why we're focusing on it. And so they're up there at the same time. Now the Persians have come roaring across and control the Safavid dynasty, the Shiites, and they're controlling all of the eastern part of Afghanistan. At the same time that the Mughals have reached their height, but are starting to fade. And the Uzbeks were in place, not briefly, but for 285 years. So they started off in 1500 as contending. The dominant player in 1500 was, of course, Ismail, who came from Ardabil. He was the Kurd, and he decided that Shiism was convenient for a new dominant religion in Persia, and it was certainly convenient because he was the reincarnation of Ali, the reincarnation of Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law and nephew at the same time. So he's Ali, and he picks up the mantle of Ali and starts this you could argue personality cult, but it certainly lasted. And he sets up his empire in Esfahan. So you remember all that. But still, on his northeast border, he has to contend with, and there are battles between the Uzbeks and the Safavids. But they're far enough away that they can set up their own khanate. So they're Muslims, but they're not Shiite, they're Sunni. And here's Khiva. If you were with us when we were doing Russia, you will remember that Khiva was the center of slavery. What kind of slavery? White slavery. So they'd venture off into southern Russia and take Russian slaves, white slaves. And you could find Russian white slaves on the market, even in Venice. We looked at that phenomenon. So all the way over to Venice, the slave market would go. And this was one incentive for the Russians to once and for all conquer the South. Much in the way that America conquered the West, the Russians came down and subdued the stands, and obviously we remember they all became Soviets. So there was a Kazakhstan Soviet, there was a Uzbek Soviet, a Tajik Soviet. In that sense, the Soviet Union was very multinational, international grouping, as this whole area is, as we've talked about. But that was Khiva, and that was one of the first destinations for the Russian military in the 1800s. So it's just fun making these connections across time and in history. It just helps fix things. And so here we are, Kabul sitting here, obviously in the shadow. Kandahar is a little bit further away. Peshawar is a Pashtun city, and of course it's in Pakistan, but it is the Pashtun city of all Pashtun cities, and it was the center of American aid to the Mujahideen who were fighting the Russians, who finally decided to try to take over all of Afghanistan, not on a commie whim, but as an extension of something that had been going on for 200 years. And one of the reasons for it was white slavery. So I think this is probably going to be a good period to stop. This is that map that I showed when we were looking at the 1800s. The Russian Empire was already down this far, and pretty soon it was going to take in all these folks, but never. The border would wind up being Afghanistan, which they started to try to correct in 1978. So I think that's a good place to stop. I will take questions. Okay, I went a little bit over, so.
Wait, I have a quick question. Neil was talking to me, so I couldn't hear. So you said, do you have time for me to ask this? Because you have to go to a class. I could email.
No. I'm good.
Okay, so you had mentioned that the British East Indies Company caused the change in governance in 1818, but I thought they were a trading company. Were they actually military?
Well, they shifted. At one point, they took on military responsibility and became a part of the British Empire with full troops. I don't know, you remember the movie Gandhi, right? You saw the absolute worst deployment of the British Army in Amritsar. Am I saying that right, Aiko? Amritsar against the Sikhs. So no, I can't give you the exact date, but certainly 1857 might have been the hallmark. We will see that was the great Sepoy mutiny against the British. And I think after that, the British knew that if they were going to continue to be able to squeeze wealth out of India, they were going to need a military presence. By the way, that is the date of the official fall of the Mughals. The Mughals were still hanging on, and the British were still talking to them. But in 1857, with the Sepoy Revolt, the Brits said, you know what? You're not doing your share on security here, and we don't need you anymore. And when they did that, that was when the Deobandi took a supercharge and made one of their main planks that we will always be against infidels coming in to Muslim territories. Sound familiar? But that's what happened in 1857. So that was a big date. I would guess, Carol, that they really sent heavy reinforcements after that, because India was just too lucrative.
The Sepoy Mutiny was the one where they were forced to chew off the bullets that had pig fat, wasn't it?
I haven't reviewed that recently, but that rings a bell.
That was my memory of it, but also it was a lie. They didn't have pig fat. They just were told that was just a rumor that was incorrect.
Oh, that got them going.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I'll pay special attention to that as I continue to read.
Thank you. This is
Thank
great.
you.
Okay, folks.
Thank you, John.
All right. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.